Welcome to the lecture series of climate protection, the third session at this season. Can you please close the doors? Thank you very much. First of all, for the people behind the screens, if you want to discuss with us, Rainer Pfluger sent the link mail for the GoToMeeting link 10 minutes ago. So if you want to, you can also join there. Today, we have a lecturer. His name is Thomas Schubatzky. He's located here in the University of Innsbruck. He works at the Institute for Specialization Didactics at the Department of the Subject Didactics. Today he will speak out about climate change education and education for sustainable development, which is one of his special research interests. At the moment, he is involved in the current research project on climate change education in physics teaching. Moreover, he performs research about professionalization among prospective physics teachers, as well as on the inculcation theory as an approach to developing fake news resilience in science education. But today he is focused more on education and the governance. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm looking forward to his presentation, looking forward by looking back, future thinking in climate change education.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Before I start, I want to do a quick check. Can everyone hear me well? Not too loud? Yeah? Take this as a yes. Then I need to switch to presentation, right? And then I'm good to go. So, hi everyone. I'm really happy that so many of you came actually here in the room to listen to my lecture talking about a topic I'm very passionate about, which is climate change education. And for this day's talk, that shows the topic looking forward by looking back. So it's about thinking about the future in the context of climate change that helps us tackle problems that we have today. And through my talk, I basically want to construct two overarching arguments that support why we should do this and how this can help us when it comes to climate change education. So first, I'm going to give a little introduction into climate change education in general, and then I'm going to go into these two arguments I want to make. Okay, so let's dive into the topic. Everyone of you is, I think, well aware of the things that happened last August in Oberland. Especially here are some videos from St. Anton am Aarberg. It was a heavy flood event, basically swept away.
Enorme wassermasse har naturligt avgiftsstorm som kanton i Tiroler Alpenlandschaft.
And this in the next years, but when looking at current research, this flood risk is increasing in the next years and centuries. Not only flood risk, but also the flood volume is supposed to increase depending on emission scenarios. So quite a grim outlook actually. And because of that, it might not be surprising then that empirical investigations with younger people reflect this. For example, on a survey with over 10,000 students from 16 to 25 years in Germany, when pressed with the question, does climate change make you think any of the following things? Answered in this way. So about 2/3 said that the future makes them optimistic. When pressed with the question, they said no. Actually, 3/4 thought that the future is frightening to them. Even more than half of them said that basic humanity is doomed and they won't have access to the same opportunities as their parents. And maybe also things they most value will be destroyed. So an even grimmer picture even. However, these questions were all framed in the context of climate change. When looking at the broader picture, what you can see is actually somewhat of a duality in young people's thinking about the future, in the sense that younger people have pessimistic as well as optimistic views about the future basically at the same time. And what I mean by that is that persons or younger people often have a positive or view it as a positive self-controlled future when it comes to their personal future. They have everything in their own hands when it comes to their own personal life, but a rather hopeless, frightening global future. So when looking at the bigger picture. And this is often called so-called two-track thinking, in which the global long-term future of us as a society is conceptualized completely separate or separately from one's own personal future. So what I want to address in this talk today is that climate change education should address this problem and make it possible to get an overlap between these two separately conceptualized futures in order to also gain a positive, self-controlled view of the future, of the global future. So this leads me to this idea of why climate change education. And basically, when looking at literature, the idea of climate change education is that it can help us to envision such a future and also to reach this future. For example, Chang, in his book about climate change education, writes that it is through education that we can ensure that there is a sustainable future for the Earth. And while this is a good idea, sometimes I think there is put a lot of pressure, actually too much pressure, onto education when it comes to solving climate change, especially when you think about younger people, when actually it is today that we need to make the decisions in order to reach this sustainable future. But nonetheless, this is what I tell all the prospective teachers I'm teaching. Of course, we can agree that as an educator, one cannot ignore the social responsibility to advance the educational discourse on this matter. So climate change education makes sense. The UNESCO says that it should help people understand and address the impacts of the climate crisis, and this is through knowledge, skills, values, as well as attitudes, in order to act on climate change in the sense of an agent of change. And this is also a quite broad spectrum and things climate change education should address. It is about knowledge, skills, values, as well as attitudes. So this is a complex matter, actually. But when it comes to this global idea of reaching a sustainable future, nonetheless, education play a significant role. And to think about the ways education can play a role in this global future, it is helpful to look at the concept of social tipping dynamics, as argued by Otto and others, where they think of social tipping dynamics as somewhat similar to tipping elements in the climate system. So you all might be familiar with tipping elements in the climate system. So these are basically points we don't want to overreach because there will be severe consequences that we have no control over. And this idea of social tipping dynamics is somewhat the inverse of it. So you can think of our Earth in a business as usual state at the moment. It's not working here. As somewhat of a, maybe you can see the, no, this does not work. Okay, it's just fine. So on the left hand side, you can see our Earth in this business as usual state, heavily dependent on fossil fuels, the way things work at the moment. And in order to reach this decarbonized state of our Earth, certain social barriers or social tipping elements or social barriers need to be overcome in order to reach this decarbonized state. So social tipping element would then be an element that lowers these barriers that keep us from getting to this decarbonized state of the Earth. So, and climate change education actually, in this concept, is seen as one of these social tipping elements, among others, of course. Well, incentivizing the financial market would also be a social tipping element in this concept. Also, human settlements, norms and values are something that play a role in overcoming these barriers. But as you can see here, I've circled it in red, the education system and climate change education is something that maybe takes effect in about 10 to 30 years, according to this system. So keep in mind, climate change education is something worthwhile pursuing, also something we need to do, but it is not rightful to say it is the future generation that needs to put things in, only the future generation that needs to put things in hand, when it's actually the decision makers today. But certainly teachers and students can and should act as important change agents that set things in motion in order to potentially trigger domino effects in this system. Okay, so what are the goals of climate change education? Overall, it is to empower learners to act in the climate crisis. So I'm going to put much effort on this acting, getting into climate action. And when you look at the literature, well, it is about knowledge, skills, values, also attitudes that allow us to get into action. And in the rest of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about what knowledge do we need? Do we need some knowledge, and how do we actually get into action? And maybe what hinders us to get into action when it comes to climate change education. Okay, as I'm coming from physics education research, and since many of the scientific principles underlying climate change are physics principles, of course, it's only in my nature to first talk about knowledge, about these scientific underpinnings of climate change that are needed to understand in order to maybe go into the action. And of course, when you think about what do I even need to understand to have a working understanding of climate change, it may vary depending on the field you're coming from. So I'm coming from a physics perspective, might be totally different when you come from economics, biology, geology background, or something like that. However, when you look at the literature, and also we've done in previous studies interviews with climate scientists coming from different backgrounds, these 5 topics often come up as sort of the key content areas one needs to understand in order to get a basic understanding of how climate change works actually. And this, of course, might not surprise you that you need to have a basic understanding of the constitution of Earth's atmosphere, also percentages of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, also what's the difference between weather, that weather is like on a short time scale and climate on a longer, also that there are feedback mechanisms within the climate system, how the carbon cycle works, and of course, sort of as a central phenomena, the greenhouse effect. What we did in our research in the last years was we wanted to get an idea of how well these concepts are understood by younger people, students on average, in order to get an idea of how we need to transform our education system, especially in physics teaching, when it comes to understanding climate change. And here what I'm going to show is a cross-sectional study that we performed with over 600 students. So they were right before either their Matura or their Abitur in Germany. So it was 11th or 12th grade in Austria and Germany. We had this test instrument with 36 questions addressing these content areas. And I'm not going to go into too much details, but the main takeaway message basically is on the x-axis, you can see these 5 content areas we addressed in this test instrument. And on the y-axis, there is something written as the average item difficulty. So in plain words, it is how difficult on average are questions related to these content areas when students are asked. And these percentages are the percentages of, so for weather and climate, for questions related to weather and climate, 58% of all questions were answered correctly by these 600 students. It's a little bit more than half. And these are the ones that are like at the end of their secondary school. So not too bad, not too good either. Same goes for climate as a system. So easy feedback mechanisms, they could identify about half of them. But when it was, what was really alarming for us was a working understanding of the greenhouse effect. Only even less than a quarter had like an idea about how the greenhouse effect actually works. It was even worse for questions that addressed Earth's atmosphere. For example, more than half of the people we asked thought that greenhouse gases make up 30, 50% or more of Earth's atmosphere. And this, of course, can lead to wrong decisions and wrong conclusions when it comes to addressing problems related to climate change. And I could talk about learning about these scientific principles for hours and hours, but today I want to give like a broader idea of climate change education. So I'd rather talk a little bit about why it actually matters to learn about these things, to have an understanding of the greenhouse effect, and that greenhouse gases only make up less than 1% of Earth's atmosphere. And this matters because knowledge practically sets the base for the acceptance of political measures, for democratic participation, and making evidence-based decisions. Because if you don't know about the evidence, we cannot make evidence-based decisions, I would argue. However, when you look at, so maybe let's go this way. I'm going to talk a little bit about a study from Thaler and Brudermann from the University of Graz. They did something quite similar to what we did. They asked lay people, basically adults, I think over 1,000 throughout Austria, and they asked them questions about climate change. 10 questions directly related to climate change to get an idea of their knowledge, and also how sure they were that their answer is correct. And what they found basically is that the confidence in their own answer from all these people was the highest when the answer was incorrect. So people had more confidence in the answer when they were actually wrong. And this can become a real problem, since such a combination of half knowledge and then overconfidence can become a serious problem when it really distorts reality and can lead to wrong decisions. So the point I want to make here, physics teaching, science teaching, education in general needs to include teaching about causes and consequences of climate change in the first place to sort of set this base in order to then talk about climate action. And then you, of course, can you ask yourself, okay, does higher knowledge and maybe also more climate-friendly attitudes also go hand in hand with action? Because when you think about teaching in school, right, you learn about climate change, you learn, okay, I need to behave aware of sustainability issues, and then I will also act accordingly. And when looking at empirical studies, the answer is yes, but rather no, especially when it comes to knowledge, since many studies have demonstrated that fostering knowledge alone, but also developing climate-friendly attitudes is not enough actually to encourage, doesn't matter if it's young people, adults, or any other people, it's basically not enough to encourage people to take action. For example, a study by Kleinhückelkotten in Germany showed that there is even a negative correlation between climate-friendly attitudes and people's actions. Okay, so the people that said, okay, I'm climate friendly, I want to act this way, I'm inclined with this style of living had higher CO2 emissions. And it was rather much more predicted by person's income. So the more person earned, the more people earned, the higher was the CO2 emission. And climate-friendly attitudes had nothing to do with it. It had something to do with it, but it was a negative correlation. So imparting knowledge, also talking about attitudes might not be enough at this point. Here I'm going to show also results from a meta-analytical studies by colleagues performed at the University College in Freiburg. They basically took a look at all climate change education studies that have been out for the last 20 years or so, and they took a look at how effective these were. And they looked at how effective these are in developing knowledge, how effective these are when it comes to developing climate-friendly attitudes, and then also when it comes to behavior. So the results here were that climate change education at the moment is very good at fostering knowledge in students. So we had a pretty large effect size when it comes to developing knowledge in teaching. It had a smaller effect size when it comes to attitudes, and then an even smaller effect size when it comes to developing actually climate-friendly behavior, taking action. So the current state is that climate change education instruction leads to knowledge, but way less to attitudinal change and also behavioral change. And yeah, so I'm not going to go into the details. What's even more interesting here is that some of these studies found a so-called adolescent dip in sustainability awareness. So what they found was, do we need to adjust something? Okay. So what they basically found was that there is a decline in sustainability awareness or sustainability attitudes, especially in the age of adolescence, so between 13 and 16 years maybe. And what the study by Olsen and Gericke found, and this is the point I want to make that leads me further in my argument, that this effect was greater. So there was a greater dip in sustainability awareness for schools that had an education for sustainable development certificate. So schools that said about themselves, we want to approach education for sustainable development, we want to advertise education for sustainable development, had a greater adolescent dip when it comes to attitudes and sustainability awareness. And of course, this study is 10 years old. So when you think about education for sustainable development from 10 years ago, if you remember, how it was done oftentimes was, you should separate garbage. You should watch out how you use the water. You should go by bike instead of car. You should do this, you should do that, and so on. And every one of you, I guess, has been 13 to 16 years old. And for those of you who are in regular contact to 13 to 16-year-olds, you know that I don't like being said what they have to do. So maybe it's about the way climate change education or education for sustainable development was done that actually maybe even had a negative effect when it comes to reaching this sustainable future. And in the discourse around education for sustainable development or climate change education, going to use these two now as sort of interchangeable because I'm going to focus on this climate change education issue. Nowadays, think about 3 different approaches when it comes to education for the sustainable development. And the first one basically was the one I was just talking about. So it's really an instrumental approach to education for sustainable development. It's about transfer of expert knowledge. It's about promoting sustainable behavior. You should act in this way. You should do this. You should do that. And because of this, it's about learning for sustainable development. And of course, this can become problematic when it comes to tackling the systematic problems that we have when it comes to reaching a sustainable future. And this was recognized in the literature. So based on this instrumental view of education for sustainable development, sort of emancipatory approaches of education for sustainable development emerged that said, okay, we know that there is no sustainable behavior, but every behavior and every type of climate change, climate action is associated with pros and cons. And oftentimes there are inner conflicts when it comes to how to behave or how to act environmentally conscious. So this emancipatory approach is rather about, okay, when we think about, I don't know, reducing CO2 emission of our school, how can we approach this? What are the problems associated with it? What are might be even new problems that come up when we want to lower our CO2 emissions? So it's more about critiquing, reflecting about climate action and acknowledging that there is uncertainty and contradictions even associated with acting pro-environmental. So in this way, it is much more seen as learning as sustainable development. And then, of course, this vision free of the education sustainable development then tries to overcome these contradictions while acknowledging them to proceed further when it comes to reaching a sustainable future. So it's a constant evaluation, critiquing one's own actions, and then gets to a more sustainable behavior. And especially these two approaches here are seen as somewhat promising in actually promoting climate action. And for the two arguments I want to make now in this talk is, in order to get into this mode of thinking when it comes to climate change, we need to address two things. So one, learners' future-oriented thinking, the one I was talking at the beginning, or thinking about the future, must be considered and addressed in some sort, either when it comes to teaching in school, but also at university and other places. And then the second part, or the second thesis I want to discuss with you is that climate change education currently mostly addresses one-sided issues when it comes to talking about climate action. And now I'm going to dive in the first argument, in the first thesis. And thereby, I want to talk a little bit more about how young people think and feel about the future when it comes to the results of empirical studies. It's not only empirical studies, but also philosophers, sociologists, they discuss about that young people are experiencing an alarming loss of hope when it comes to climate change especially, but not only. And this, in turn, contributes to a tendency to sort of live in the present as it was the only dimension that matters. And Hartmut Rosa even said that this perception that the present is basically the only thing that matters and better not to think about the future is due to something that he calls acceleration of social change. This acceleration of social change, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a second, then leads to sort of a contraction of the present, so that this present feels at some things, it's something that really matters, and it's not about the future anymore. So this leads to time span for which social norms, for example, but also actions that apply the time span becomes shorter. To give you some examples, career changes and paths, an accelerated social change would be that, for example, looking 100, 200 years back, your grandfather would be a smith, then your father would also be a smith, you would be a smith, your son maybe would be a smith, and then few generations forward, maybe one person is thinking about changing profession. When looking back, I don't know, 60, 50, 70 years, something like that, it became very normal that you would be doing something completely different as a profession than your father, your mother, or someone else did, right? And when looking at today's world or career changes, you might do one career for 5 years at the beginning phase, then you might switch phases, and at the end you might do something completely different. So these social changes become accelerated. Same applies, according to Rosa, to fashion consumer behavior. So fashion changed very slowly when you're looking 200 years back, and even when looking 100 or 17 years back. And nowadays, basically every season, fashion changes. So that's also another idea of accelerated social change. Also, when it comes to language change and communication, this applies according to him. So for example, people have been corresponding via letters for many, many years, centuries even. And I guess today many of you have written an email, made a WhatsApp chat, maybe called someone, also used another maybe Signal or something like that. So we'll use very different communication system, and these also change very rapidly. So this somewhat becomes a problem when this social change, this rapid social change, means that we are only worrying about what's tomorrow, but not what's in 50 years. And the problem thereby is that decisions, actions, they become directionlessness if they are neither based on the past nor oriented towards a sustainable, in our case, or stable at least, vision of the future. And how Rosa puts it, nothing remains the same, but nothing essentially changes. And that's the problem, and that's the reason why we need to talk more about the future and future thinking when it comes to climate change education. Because also studies show that unlike previous generations, young people often see the future much more as a threat than a promise, and we should and need to reverse that. Okay, this leads me back to my beginning slide of this two-track thinking and why we need to talk about future thinking in climate change education. Because this type of two-track thinking, my own personal bright future, frightening global future, is explained as sort of a coping strategy or coping mechanism to deal with fears and worries about the long-term future of our Earth, and also sort of as a defense mechanism even against, for example, eco-anxiety. Okay, so the question then arises, how do we deal with this? How can we actually overlap these two visions of the future and address this frantic standstill, as he calls it? And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Okay. Here is the live stream, and it's slightly delayed. I'm so confused. So sorry for switching slide too often times. Okay, now I get it. Okay, so when also looking at science education, I come from a science education background, so I'm going to talk about this perspective. Science education that addresses these aspects should really first and foremost address this feeling and acknowledge this feeling of disorientation. And one major goal then becomes in making the future, a sustainable future, perceivable in some kind of way, in order to then give young people agency over their own future, as well as the future of the big issues that concern us today. And this future of the big issues, I will get back to later. But now, for now, I want to talk about making the future perceivable. So, as Levrini puts it, what education in general, or science education should do then, is to help young people perceive future global scenarios as something that is imaginable. And through that, they can identify problems that need to be overcome in order to get to this now perceivable future, in order to influence and shape it through their actions. So when the goal is clear, it makes actions more tangible, is somewhat the idea of this approach. And thereby, what helps us thereby is taking a look at a research field, basically, that's called future studies, which is an interdisciplinary research field that has nothing to do with education in the first place. But what it does is that it analyzes trends, causes, and patterns of change, and also stability when it comes to thinking about the future. And what they distinguish thereby is they think about possible, probable, and also desirable futures, and how we can develop scenarios and ways of thinking about these different versions of the futures, so to say. And then investigates future thinking, so thinking about these different types of future, and then its relation to human worldviews, perceptions, emotions, knowledge, all the things I was talking about before. So the main objective of future studies in general is using projections to guide actions in the present in order to create and go towards desirable futures. And in science education, ideas from studies, from future studies, have since also found their way into teaching. And thereby the idea is to foster this future thinking, which is then directly relevant to develop agency to think about climate actions, because we know what the desirable future looks like and how we can get there. So one component that is very helpful thereby, or is oftentimes used, is the so-called futures cone. And basically, when talk about future, teaching about future thinking, this future cone can then be used as sort of a guideline to think about or to even imagine different futures. So this future cone describes the situation as it is today on the left side on the slide here. And then on the right slide, you can see maybe 30, 40 years ahead of now, you can think about different futures. Well, there is, of course, a most probable future, basically the trajectory we are on right now. However, there are quite a lot of different futures, so to say, we can think of that are also somewhat probable, depending on the actions taken today. And maybe the most important thing among them, of course, is also a desirable future, which of course depends on what we see as desirable, but there is one among them. And the idea of fostering future thinking in climate change education would then be first envisioning such a desirable future. What does it look like? How should it look like? What's it about? And then, in order to tackle problems today, perform something that's called backtracing, basically. So think about the future, what's a desirable future, and what's a problem that needs to be overcome today in order to reach this desirable future that actually can be tackled by myself. And this then automatically, well, not automatically, but then should lead to ideas of climate action that actually matter for reaching such a global future or sustainable future. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how to actually teach it, but I'm rather gonna provide some information, some links if you're interested in using it, and either for young people or also in teacher education or somewhere else, or in university, they also might work. So I'm going to quickly show you these. For example, from GermanWatch.org, there are several different ideas of addressing future thinking. There are, for example, these Zukunftsbilder, and then maybe I'm going to quickly show it. So this would not be a task to imagine a desirable future, but on this web page, there is a desirable future provided for students, and it's in the form of a so-called Wimmelbild. So there is actually a lot going on in this picture. And then you can talk about students, just take a look at the picture, find something that's different from today and that is interesting for you. And when you zoom in, you can see, for example, people going by bike from Hof ums Eck. Here also car sharing. Yeah, lots to discover in this Wimmelbild. And then going from this one provided desirable future, think about, okay, what needs to be done today in order to approach this desirable future? And this you can do with other activities. For example, to tell stories about the future. So how does a daily life look like, and how does daily life need to change in order to reach this future? Also imagine some projects and develop some scenarios. How does the world need to develop in order to reach this desirable future? There's also in English a lot of teaching materials, for example, in 2EU projects, for example, Project Fedora and also the Project IC. So actual teaching materials that you can just use for teaching directly. Also some literature related to it, how to do this, how to foster future thinking and these ideas I just presented. Also, we are currently in a research project that's called What's Ahead that addresses this idea of thinking about the future when it comes to transition to renewable energies. So this was basically the first argument I wanted to make. Introduce future thinking into climate change education to support students to make an overlap between their own personal future and the global future. And I was talking about the big issues, also tackling the big issues of today. And this is sort of the second argument I want to make, that climate change education today has a problem that it focuses heavily on private actions and individual actions. For example, by a review study from Kranz and others, they looked at basically all climate change education studies of the past, I think it was also 20 years or so, and they looked which aspects of our life climate change education initiatives or studies address. And here in this first picture, you can see that out of 33 studies, 29 only addressed the private sphere. So our daily actions, when we're switching off the light when we leave the room, are we sorting out garbage, such things. And only 5 of them addressed the public sphere. So is it, how can we make new regulations? How we want to approach this on a, how do our political parties associated, or how do political parties think about climate change in such things? Also, in another context, when political or strategic instruments such as regulations, taxations, emission trading, or agreements were discussed, so when in these initiatives they were talking about political strategic instruments, almost every time it was about voluntary agreements rather than about actual regulations. And everyone that has been in contact with climate change education can readily think about that most of the time it was the Montreal Protocol as sort of a good practice for how to solve global issues. But the thing with the Montreal Protocol, for those who don't know, there was a problem some centuries ago now, maybe 40 years ago, something like that, that FCKW-Stoffe basically made the ozone hole bigger, and this was a global problem, of course. And then what solved the problem sort of was this Montreal Protocol, where nations from all around the world got together and decided, okay, we're just gonna ban FCKW-Stoffe, and the problem is basically solved. And this is, of course, a good practice, but in this case, something that can be used to replace these was readily available, and it was even cheaper, right? So it was a practical solution to just take the other substance, and maybe it's not the best good practice for solving the climate change issue, because replacing fossil fuels is a really hard job to do. Okay, so the point I want to make here, it heavily focuses on the private sphere. Oftentimes, most of the times, does not approach or address the public sphere. And why? I'm going to quickly demonstrate why I think this is problematic. And this example I also borrowed from Kranz and Schwichow from a different talk. And they made a little calculation to put this into perspective. So if you think about how many emissions we can actually avoid through individual behavioral changes, we can make, I'm going to go through a quick example, and we make two assumptions to make a quick calculation. So first, we only consider emissions from the energy sector, right? And then we assume a constant relationship between emissions and energy. So the more energy we use, the more emissions. That's a direct relationship. We can then think about the percentage or the difference in energy we can save by individual behavior in this way. So we think about the total energy we are using, then we think about the percentage we can save when it comes to behavior overall, and then also to individual private households. When you take a look at the numbers for private households, when you take a look at Austria, for example, about 25% of Austria's energy 2024 was used by private households. And when you look about the percentage of energy or emissions that can be saved through individual behavior, Verhalten here, we can look at empirical studies, and their findings indicate that on average, if you want to save energy in your household, on average households are able to save about 7% of their emissions. When they get energy audits, so intensive individual consultations of how they can save energy at their own household, this number goes up to 13.5% of what they can save on emissions. Social comparisons, funnily enough, also is very effective. So when you get compared to your neighbors how much they are saving, you can save more than an average. However, when you take these numbers together, you can then calculate the percentage of total emissions we can save in private households. So when you think about private households, it's 0.25, right? So it's a quarter. Then you think about energy audits, maybe even think about average savings that are possible. Of these 25%, we have then 7.4%. So on average, when it comes to private households, of course, there are a lot of other things to look at when it comes to individual behavior. But just looking at the individual households, we can save about 2% of emissions if every one of us tries to save emissions in private households. That's not too much, I think. However, when looking at in comparison, at public actions, for example, the European standards for light bulbs, which was one regulation from the EU, was a regulation on eco-design requirements for household lamps. And it basically said you need to switch out your light bulbs and you need to use more efficient ones. And when taking this regulation, the theoretical energy savings in the EU was estimated at about 40 terawatt hours. One regulation of the EU, and it is this is equivalent to Romania's annual electricity consumption, and led to a reduction in CO2 emissions to about 50 million tons. And then, of course, you can think about the fraction for Austria, right? So how much energy saving does this lead to in Austria? And yeah, estimated on the energy use in the EU, you can think about 0.8 terawatt hours that was saved or can be saved in Austria through this regulation, which is about 1.3%. So in comparison, when you take household savings related to individual behavior, which was estimated at about 1.9%, and then this one EU regulation, which resulted in 1.3%, you can make a good argument, well, it makes totally sense to involve the public sphere more into climate change education and to talk more about regulations, about taxations, and how we can address this problem on a systemic level. The big issues I was talking about before. So in comparison, when it comes to climate actions in private spaces, and just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we should not think about individual behavior, because we need every percentage of emission saving we can get, basically. But the point I want to make here is that we need to also focus on the public sphere. And also when looking at research, you can see that individual actions are oftentimes associated with supporting systemic change, and supporting systemic change often is related to changing your individual behavior. So it really takes both. But most of the time, we do not speak about this public sphere, and that's a problem. So actions in private spaces relate to direct reduction of negative impact through personal behavioral change, which is a direct action, but with oftentimes a very small impact. However, compared to actions in public spaces, which is passive or active support for measures aimed at political regulation or collective behavioral change, has not maybe a direct effect, but in turn a larger impact, and should therefore also be topic of climate change education. There we can also again take a look at a survey among young people, and you can see here over 1,000 young people were asked, okay, where do you take action? Is it more in the private sphere or in the public sphere? And also you can see here a lot of people are taking action in the public sphere. A lot less people are taking action in the public sphere. So this even adds to my argument, I think. And maybe this has also something, or I'm quite sure this is also something to do with climate change education in school. Because also in school, and yeah, Grants showed it, it's oftentimes about these individual behavioral change. I'm going to show you another result from a study of Winter and others. So this was performed with prospective teachers around Vienna, and they were interviewed about how they think about climate change education. And there you can see that there are quite different visions of how climate change education can look like in actually classrooms. So when you take a look, and I'm sorry that it's in German, the interviews were in German, on the left-hand side, the person said, well, aber auf jeden Fall den Schülern auch einen Anreiz zu geben, dass sie sich dafür interessieren, aber sie können jetzt keine CO2-Steuer hervorrufen. Und das mag natürlich stimmen, sagen wir mal. Aber sie können entscheiden, ich fahre mit dem Fahrrad in die Schule oder mit dem E-Scooter. Das heißt, genau an der Stelle würde man sagen, irgendwie das ist starker Fokus auf individuelles Verhalten und irgendwie, naja, am System kann man, am Big Issue kann man eigentlich nichts fördern, oder? Das, I need to switch back to English. So this sort of supports this two-track thinking, right? I can change my own individual behavior, but to systemic, I have no chance to participate. Whereas others said, well, es ist mir auch sehr wichtig, dass sie lernen, was sie persönlich mit in ihrem Alltag ändern können, also weil halt, das ist halt das Einzige, was sie tun können, okay? And then, so was dann wirklich so zum Umsetzen, ich glaube, das fehlt ihnen dann, sie wissen, was alles passieren könnte und sie wissen, wer dafür eintritt, aber sie wissen, glaube ich, nicht, was sie machen können, außer halt auf die Demos zu gehen. And this would one be a public action maybe, right? Going to a demo, signing a petition or something like that. So this prospective teacher at least thinks about taking public or talking about public action. And then on the right-hand side, der Person sagt, ja, und dann würde ich, glaube ich, schon in Richtung Partizipation reingehen, weil nur davon reden, dass ich mich auch politisch aktiv einsetzen muss, damit was passieren kann oder damit es weitergeführt wird. Wie ich das machen würde, weiß ich jetzt nicht, aber das würde ich dann schon irgendwie einbringen. So this person is thinking about taking it to the public sphere and talking about climate action in the public sphere, but basically has no idea how to do it. And I think that's somewhat, at least from a science education perspective, maybe other fields are more advanced when it comes to this issue. This is sort of the place we are right now. How to introduce public sphere and public action into effective climate change education. So to sum it up, and I'm going to talk actually about climate agency in the last few minutes. Climate change education, the private sphere, the way it is right now is that there is a focus of understanding the problem and individual reduction of CO2 emissions. And this leads to a shift in responsibility oftentimes to the private sphere. And oftentimes direct actions in the private sphere are addressed with little effect. What's only seldom seen is collective, publicly effective actions, and no questioning of structures oftentimes takes place when it is actually very much needed. So climate change education should really focus about empowerment, support learners on the path to become responsible young citizens to really participate in a political democratic system in order to take actions to the public sphere. And thereby, this concept of human agency in the Anthropocene is something that's talked about a lot at the moment when it comes to climate change education. It even is a part now of the PISA Science Framework 2025. So even the OECD thinks that human agency is something we should pursue in today's age. And they say that agency is the capacity, opportunity, and also willingness to act intentionally and to see themselves as capable to engage with and act on issues that matter personally, but also collectively. And for this, we also need future thinking again. So the idea of this agency approach is that individuals are not helpless victims when it comes to the climate crisis, but see the climate crisis much more as an opportunity for necessary and feasible progress in order to reach this transformation needed. Okay, here the science framework. And then, and this will be my last point to make, when thinking about agency, about taking action, you can now think in sort of a quadrant here, where there is individual action, or agency, and collective. And there are also everyday actions I can take. And there are actions I can take strategic politically. And following from the idea before, oftentimes we talk about everyday individual action, when we actually should maybe talk about individual strategic political action. In climate change education, for example, analyze arguments for example, supporters and opponents of wind turbines, for example, discuss them, and also to get into this strategic political thinking, analyze party platforms, what their stance is regarding to this issue, and if this is evidence-based or not. It's not about telling students what to vote or how to vote, but it's about helping them investigate these issues and discuss about evidence-based approaches when it comes to climate change. Also, when you can also think about everyday collective actions. Came up with an example, for example, everyday action through critical consumption. So what you could do, you could research companies, for example, brands that have a high carbon footprint or poor environmental practices, for example. You can research alternatives, and then you can go public in your school, for example, make a board, how did I call it? I called it somewhat a collective boycott list of companies you want to boycott because of their climate protection practices, and also provide some alternatives that are more feasible. Would be an example of everyday collective action. And then you can also think about the collective strategic political action, and thereby this idea of whole school approaches or schools for future is something you could think about getting on board with householders, with the principals at your school, and try at your school collectively, how can we make our school, for example, more emission efficient. Also from German Watch, they call this approach to climate change education sort of increasing your Handabdruck. Instead of lowering your footprint, you should increase your Handabdruck, make your actions matter, make your actions reach other people, go into the public sphere and make it collective. So in summary, what I wanted to talk about is that young people's future thinking is shaped by both hope and fear, resulting in this dual vision I was talking about a lot, that is characterized by personal optimism versus global pessimism. And the climate change education can help address this by making the future tangible, imaginable, and in turn then actionable, or at least it should do. And thereby climate change education is then seen as sort of a social tipping element that has this transformative potential to empower students, help them gain agency, not only in the private sphere. So climate change education should shift from a private sphere focus to support public engagement and collective agents, because it hasn't been doing so in the past, in order to promote this idea of education for sustainable development 2 and 3. And with that, I'm done with my talk. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to discuss all the things I was saying in the last hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. Is there any questions in the audience?
On? Yeah. Thank you very much for this great talk. I was wondering how this concept of personal optimism and global pessimism compares to the past. Like, is this something that's specific to the 21st century? Or is this something that was already perceived in like the 60s, 70s, like decades when people were also dealing with really difficult issues like wars? I wanted to know how that compares to this. And second, if yes or no, depending on the answer, what can we learn from that? Like, what can we learn from the future vision of past decades, so to say?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. So I'm not a psychologist. So when talking about has this been investigated before in other contexts, I'm not sure. I know that this sort of externalizing the global future and separating from oneself is, as Norbert put it, it is a defense mechanism, right? To just not think about it and concentrate on oneself. So I might support your idea that this is not something that only applies to the climate crisis. And it doesn't even need to only apply to the climate crisis, because there is one desirable future, right, that encompasses different aspects and ideas. And it's not even that important that that it's about the climate crisis. But what's the problem with climate crisis? I think that this is a problem that especially addresses the future, the global future, and maybe not so much, more and more every day, but not so much my actions today. So I I don't think it is special to the climate crisis, but I think it is especially important for when talking about the climate crisis, since it is a problem that's far away and that addresses the global future. And the second part of your question was, what can we learn? What can we learn from it?
Whether the views about the future have always been that pessimistic, you know, of youngsters. And
yeah. So there are some studies. I was thinking about incorporating in a slide, because there are some studies, like in the 70s or so, that were thinking, when sort of this issue came up and everyone was aware, that there were some studies that investigated this. And basically, a lot of time, the future now is more brighter than they envisioned it in certain aspects, than they envisioned it back then. So yeah, this would actually be a thing. Maybe I can put the slide into my presentation and send it out afterwards. So there were some examples actually where this was thought about, and it might be interesting to compare that the future is actually more optimistic than people envisioned it 50 years ago or so.
Because then I think one could learn something about how to educate people about the future when the perspective on the future now is actually better than it was in the 70s or in the 60s, I guess. Maybe.
One could make an argument if that's actually the case, I think, depending on how you ask, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
There are any other questions?
Thank you for your call. Nice presentation. Maybe just small reaction to that. I think it was Cold War. People were very scared of Cold War and nuclear war, so they were not very positive about the future. I know my parents or grandparents, they had like every week or every month preparation for nuclear war, so that's not very positive, regardless of the climate change. And regarding the climate change and education, there is this one, I would say philosopher, Bioaccumulate, and he calls for slower urgencies, because as we are closer to the climate crisis, or like the tipping point, we tend to freak out or stress much, and we tend to do really irrational decisions, and we feel like we don't have time, right? So if also we should incorporate some emotional awareness, or like keeping calm, even though the world's gonna be burning more and more, and there's gonna be more floods and everything, because we now have to like this urgency to solve this issue right now, but we cannot solve this in half year, 1 year, even 5 years or 10 years. So how to teach young people? How can I teach myself this actually? That would be a good question for me. Thank you.
Also tackling the big issues here. So I think basically that's something that needs to happen in education anyway, right? So I think when thinking about school and what we want to teach in school and what we want to foster in students, this might be skills that we want to foster anyhow. So, and especially for myself, right, coming from a physics background, what we do in physics is we attack problems and we dissect it, make it into smaller problems, tackle these problems and try to think these smaller problems through in order to piece it then back together in order to get a picture of the big problem. So that's something that we need to talk about anyhow. How well this is working depends, of course, on students, on teachers, and on the system, basically. So that makes it even more important that, for example, teacher education is something we want to subsidize. We want to have good teachers. We want to have high quality teaching in order to empower students to develop, for example, such problem-solving skills. And for example, when looking at problem-solving skills, it's always rooted in domain-specific knowledge. So if we want to make problem-solving when it comes to the climate crisis, I need to have basic understandings of the principles that guide my problem in order to gain into the problem-solving mode, so to say. So I think if we have high quality education system, this already helps and also aligns with other problems we need to tackle. Yeah. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but
Thank you. There are any other questions? If not, I would have one question. um, can you jump to the slide? I think it was 3 or 4 to the social tipping points. I'm super interested in because I think tipping points are super interesting because we can see them, but just if we look back in the past. But it would be super interesting. One back, I think. Yeah. But it would be super nice to see them in the future, so that we know where are the tipping points and we can use them. But I thought when I saw these slides, limit of growth was written in 1972, and I think that was a point where, at least in the scientific community, we had a big discussion about that. So if I think about that, you said that it needs more or less 30 years that we can achieve a tipping point.
When it comes to climate change education, for it to take effect, 10 to 13 years was their estimation in this article, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you look at the financial market, they estimated a very rapid effect in under a year. So yeah.
Okay. So if I count from the limit of growth, and I would say it needs 15, 20 years or 10 years to trickle down from the scientific community to the society, or to the teachers and to the people who educate us. So it will, and then they educate the childrens, and I count 15 years more, 20 years more. Shouldn't be that now all that we should be achieve one of the tipping points, that the society are that we overruled it, and then now can we see like something like that? Is there some papers they saying that we achieved one?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, I think we need to talk about the assumptions of this taking effect, because the assumption here basically is that climate change education is effective and it actually empowers people to act on it. And with my talk, I somewhat made the argument that it doesn't, or not, at least not as effective as we maybe want it to be. So, and this is also, I didn't talk about it in the talk, but on this slide, it's a very simplified idea, right? When you look at social complexities, overcoming these barriers is much more like in the picture below, where these bumps change depending on current developments. So if you think about what climate change education should entail today, doesn't mean that it's the climate change education we need in 20 years from now. So it's rather about this current re-evaluation and thinking about changing contexts, changing situation in the world, especially at the moment. I think this becomes even more evident. So while this 10 to 30 years might be a good estimate to think about the time frame of where education actually could come into effect, when making actually a prediction, it becomes evident that this is only a very rough estimate. So, and I think it would be very hard to relate changes in educational systems all over the world to relate it then to developments So I'm not aware of any study that actually looked into this. But of course, you can ask the question. So we had many decades of the education for sustainable development. Bottom line, what did we achieve? Mixed answer.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think the worst thing that could happen is when young people get into a state of frustration. These things are too important just to leave them and the decisions to the politicians. So if you want to take public action, I would like to invite you to an event on the 2nd of May this year. It's a day that we proclaimed as the Day for Protection of the Alps. And we are presenting a film at 4:30 p.m. in the Leo Kino. Free entry. The film is about glacier melting. And after this film, there is a discussion with politicians, with scientists. So come to that event.
Nice. Thank you very much. So 2nd of May was it, yeah? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, I wanted to ask if you had any information or if you were aware of how it impacted what you just explained with the social tipping points and the education, if the education is in later years, so with 13 to 16 or already in kindergarten.
So this is, I borrowed this idea. I'm rather into physics education, science education. This is related to different aspects of the educational system. So I'm not an expert in this field. I could maybe look it up, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you would even measure and get an idea of how this effect would look like, how you can make it tangible, and how you would expect it to be, right? Because it's very too hard to define these ideas. Well, maybe one thing, the OECD is trying to do it, right? They're trying to integrate this idea of agency in the Anthropocene, and they are now trying to get an idea of what agency students aged 14 to 15 are having all over the world at the moment. So maybe we'll have an idea when it comes to results of the new PISA 2025. But it will take 1 to 2 years to get the results, of course.
Thanks.
So if there are no other questions, thank you for the lecture. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for coming. And we'll see you next week, I think. Oh, no, in 2 weeks, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.